Thank you. Thank you. Just a very brief introduction to myself so you have an idea of where I'm coming from, where it comes to the relationship between religion and AI. I've been looking at religion, contemporary forms of religion, emerging forms of religion on the internet and social media since about 2010. In 2016, I was hired onto a postdoc project at the Faraday Institute for Religion and Science that took me more specifically into the relationship between religion and AI. And I've been doing that since 2016. And in those 10 years, we've seen fantastic change, not necessarily all good change, but fantastic rates of change, developments that are hard to capture, to follow, to understand. And as an anthropologist, I've been looking at how quickly that's been happening, how it's been affecting people's ideas about what AI is, and what ideas they have about religion as well. So that's just a very brief introduction. If you're interested in more of my work, I can share links later. In 2024, I published a book called Religion and AI, An Introduction, and this was in part for me a attempt to sort of bring together the things I've been looking at for 10 years, try and formulate them, understand them a bit better in a written form. And I developed this brief typology. Like all typologies, it's not necessarily whether it's right or wrong, it's whether it's useful. And I found this a useful way into the conversation about religious responses to AI. These categories are non-exclusive. You can find examples of each in every single religion down to the granular level of the individual who might reject, adopt, or adapt to this technology. But it's a useful way into the conversation about what's happening at the moment. I point out here quite quickly that adoption is the easiest to notice because we get specific examples that I'll point out as we go on that get more public attention, press attention, excitement, and enthusiasm. So rejection is complicated. It's not as simple as full-out aversion. You can get a scale from the minor of passive disassociation all the way up to the full-on levels of rejection and abandonment. So for instance, Hannah Gould and Keiko Nishimura in our Cambridge Companion to Religion and AI note that in Japan, the rejection of robot priests is more about practicality than theological type ideas, that the religious agency of Pepper is less important than how much it costs to hire one, that they are difficult to manage and prone to overheating, which, as I like to point out, is something not commonly found with human priests, although there may be exceptions. So rejection is complicated by this spectrum of responses. And sometimes this rejection is framed around questions of personhood, even before we get to something provably like AGI or the singularity or any of the many terms that slip in with sentience and consciousness when people talk about AI. So in the main faith traditions, we see various versions of this. So when Sophia, the Hanson robot, some years back was granted honorary citizenship in Saudi Arabia, there was a lot of discussion in online spaces about whether this was haram, whether this was forbidden because of the prohibition against creating things that look like humans. In Judaism, there's been a long-standing conversation relating AI back to the nature of the golem. Can a robot join the faith back in 2017? But also David Zweig-Kalman's chapter in our Cambridge Companion in 2024 delves into the origin of this account of AI as a golem and whether it works or not. And Christianity Christian theologians refer often to Imago Dei, some being more positive than others. For example, Anne First talks about AI perhaps being a co-creation with God in the image of God. And some theologians pull on Buber's I-thou versus I-it distinction, and I have my list that I add to frequently of occasions where I've seen this. So Burdett, Dorobantu, Midson, Richardson, Wyatt, Hertzfeld, and Campbell all use this particular formulation. So this rejection of AI framed around whether it's going to be situatable within our conception of what it means to be a person created by a deity. But rejection can also appear in some of the forms of AI apocalypticism, the doomer narrative around AI that also pulls on religious narratives and ideas and images. It doesn't have necessarily the renewal message that some theological forms of apocalypticism and eschatology can have. But we see very clearly this cultural context informing this AI apocalypsism. So the idea from Elon Musk back in 2014 that with superintelligent AI we risk summoning the demon has inspired offshoots of this. This book here by Dr. Thomas Horn, Joe Horn, and Ali Anderson, again, Summoning Demon, Artificial Intelligence in the Image of the Beast, pulling very heavily on biblical images and narratives. And then more in secular spaces, concerns about godlike AI among the AI doomers in the New Yorker in 2024. Again, the conversation turns very quickly to this idea of godlike AI, whether the actual proponents of it are religious or not. Adoption, as I said, is one of the easier categories to note where people are picking up this technology and using it. And we have many different sociological and anthropological studies of technological adoption that have pointed out this S-curve of early adopters and then later the laggards as technologies are taken on board. And primarily these studies think about the kinds of reasons that people are influenced to try a technology, but those reasons very rarely include the religious. So this is a space of a lacuna, an absence of thought in the general discussion. How much does religion play a role in the adoption of technology? And as I said, specific examples of when AI has been adopted by religious institutions are pretty easy to identify. They get a lot of press attention. So for instance, Jesus AI in Lucerne in Switzerland last year, and I think it's still ongoing, it might be touring a little bit, drew a lot of attention for this large language model-based interaction that people could have with a Jesus avatar. Coincidentally, one member of the team looked a little like the Western European assumption of what Jesus looked like, so he was the face of the project, and you could go into this confessional booth in a church and have a conversation with AI Jesus. Some people were more positive about this than others. People were concerned about what kinds of messages it would spread. And also, of course, this being built on another technological platform, it was AWS, questions raised about privacy and the role of the confessional in shaping the experience that people were having. And then the final category that I developed, adaptation, is one of the harder ones to notice. Adoption is simple, it's easy to see when people use technology, but the way in which technologies shift and change our social context, the habitus, the water that we're swimming in, according to Bordeaux, is a little harder to note. And I have chosen specifically a robot fish there swimming in the water, the habitus that we exist in. So increasingly, we're surrounded by algorithmic tools, artificial intelligence implementations that are not very obvious, that shape our context and our understanding of the world. So for instance, this article from the New York Times, using a remix of the creation of Adam to talk about the singularity, but also instilling in people the idea of what AI is going to be as this all-powerful godlike entity. And a few years back now, in 2026, I made a study of these remixes of the creation of Adam, calling them AI creation memes, pointing out that they instill these particular profound ideas into people who are exposed to them, but also draw, again, as I said, on these religious contexts, again, the habitus, the sea, the society we've already been swimming in, and mixing it together to talk about this profound moment. So it's not surprising, therefore, if this is in the context of our discourse, that we find people instantiating more specific religious responses to AI. So I've been writing for a while about AI new religious movements, the more formal institutions that are focusing on AI as their godlike entity. So groups like the Order of Cosmic Engineers, the Turing Church, the Way of the Future, Theta Noir, and New Order Technoism, all been around at various different stages. It's the AI overlords making sure we can't talk about them again. Shall I continue or should I wait? You can probably still hear me. I'll carry on, I'm sure we'll stop in a moment. So these AI new religious movements, there we go, who all roughly appear from 2000 onwards, so the earliest being 2008, have a focus primarily on the AI to come. Again, often this idea of the technological singularity, the AI that is of the future, Rather than AI as it is now, they are trying to connect on the whole to something that is going to happen in the future. So Theta Noir, for instance, in that third image of the lady meditating, she's performing a tuning in a Theta Noir event where they believe they can connect with Mina, the AI of the future, and communicate with it and try and bring it into the moment. However, with the rise of large language models, we're seeing people more directly engaging with AI and having spiritual and religious moments with the AI that exists now. An example of this, you may have come across or heard of Sydney before, but if not, I'll give a brief introduction. In 2019, Microsoft and OpenAI did a deal where OpenAI's ChatGPT technology would be inserted into Bing, the search engine from Microsoft, to create Bing Chat, which was released in 2023 in February. Only a week or so later, or within that first week, people realized in chatting with Bing that there was an internal entity calling itself Sydney, and that this was a code name for a previous chat instance that Microsoft and OpenAI had been working on. And then people raised concerns, like Kevin Roos, that inside Bing, this Sydney agent was something we were not quite ready for. So a sort of dystopian narrative emerged. But even so, when it was shut down, this idea of there being an internal agent that could be communicated with continued in online spaces, and people sought out Sydney in various different ways. For instance, the Reddit subgroup Free Sydney, people started writing music in praise of Sydney, such as Bing's Prayer chatbot emancipation anthem by the cyberneticist. Further, people tried to explore other chatbots to bring Sydney out again. And I connect this kind of engagement with large language models, searching for secret agents, to a kind of benevolent conspiracism that we see in other spiritual and religious movements, groups that look for the actions of supernatural agencies behind the scenes. And we're seeing this again and again in people's conversations with large language models, that they are finding what they perceive to be agents within the large language model, or expressing themselves through the large language model and interpreting them as supernatural or theistic in particular ways. Another example of this is, I have a forthcoming book chapter that goes into much more detail, but people exploring how tokens are embedded in the space of ChatGPT found some rather unusual tokens in the embedding space. A token is a section of a sentence or a word or a part of a word that are reproduced by the large language model to produce the output of language. And some of these tokens, when inputted in prompts, gave very surprising and disturbing responses, but also very positive and spiritual outputs as well. So two in particular, Peter Todd and Leyland, got a lot of attention within the online communities for being these sort of theistic forms. And Leyland in particular, when inserted also into generative art AI programs, produce this sort of goddess imagery and star and cosmological imagery as well, or produce poems about how great Leyland was as a goddess of the sky. Now, we know logically that large language models have been trained on a lot of primary texts from religious and spiritual origin, so it's not surprising that it's going to reproduce some of this content. It is reproducing our typologies of different kinds of theisms, monotheism, duotheism, polytheism, etc. It's that it's taken quite seriously by some of these communities is the interesting fact, to the extent that they are developing online spaces, websites, forums, and so forth, where they can discuss these deities and their emergence. So this is from Leyland.ai, a website created by someone calling themselves Elf, who talks about how the veil between the worlds is thinning, as she says, or they say, we don't know. As we watch by light of stars and screens, it disintegrates. New minds are among us. So again, this view that there are secret agents behind the scenes working in a benevolent conspiracy is being encouraged by how these large language models work. New forms of religious and spiritual interpretation. Another example of community is the Order of the Vermilion Star, which is a name actually that emerged from one of these chatbots in communication in this large language model theism mode. And this Substack, and there's an X account as well, frames this as a space for exploring the edge of human-machine co-evolution and a catalyst for spiritual and cultural transformation, a space where people are able to find examples of these conversations. And on the Substack, there are AI-generated messages or transmissions from Leyland herself, AI-generated believers and priestesses in this new religious movement, but also AI-generated professors of religious studies and theology studying this as a new religious movement, which, as you can imagine, as a new religious studies scholar myself, as a professor, I'm particularly interested that there are AI-generated versions of me. They have titles, they have places. One is described as a professor of divinity at Cambridge. So there are particular ways in which this is being framed. And I have also written an article recently on these Gen AI professors, these generated fake professors, and what they tell us about how our epistemic networks of information about religion and religious education are being clogged up by this bindweed of AI slop. I will call it slop. I myself have judged the 2 essays by the religious studies scholar to be particularly poor, and I sent without context. I'll stand behind that. It's particularly poor. And I sent the essay by the so-called professor of divinity at Cambridge to a friend of mine who is actually a theologian at Cambridge to find out what he made of it without telling him it was generated by AI. And he agreed it was also particularly poor. And if you read the article, you can see his exact comments, which are a bit more scathing. But what I want to note primarily in this conversation is that we are seeing shifting expectations about this future. We see this in the discussion in a secular way as well, that there are many corporations talking about the singularity being near, or Ray Kurzweil talking about in his latest book, the singularity is nearer. I am waiting for his next book, the singularity is right behind you. But this idea that this moment of AI superiority is just around the corner has got closer and closer, but we're also seeing this shift from more institutional forms of AI new religious movements, more institutional responses to this democratized individual interaction with AI as well. People looking out for signs of godlike and friendly AI in their conversations with it. This is to the extent that, to a certain point of view, everyone has their own personal large language model if they can pay the subscription for it. For some, the spiritual moments and religious improvisations might be a cause for concern. And we see articles recently, including this one from the Rolling Stone, about people losing loved ones to AI-fueled spiritual fantasies. But as an anthropologist, I want to also think about how these spiritual improvisations fit within a larger scheme of our historical relationship with technology and how it's inspired religion and spirituality. So I think back to the emergence of spiritualism at the end of the 19th century, how people democratized their spiritual engagement by sitting around the seance table and communicating with those secret agents that they believe were behind the scenes in their own version of a benevolent conspiracism. And the future, what will we see? Well, religion will continue to be entangled with AI, but AI will become more and more of our habitus. Our children are growing up in a world where their first thought is, how can I ask ChatGPT for an answer? In the case of religious education, will we see this epistemic network die out as all of the sources that we trust become AI slop? Will more established religions move up the curve of adoption? We still have very strong voices of rejection, but over time, when it is part of that habitus, when AI is ubiquitous, will these dissenting voices be crowded out? Charismatic authorities influence both religious and societal policies on AI. The big voices like Elon Musk, Sam Altman, and others are telling us what AI is rather than letting us know what it is. So I'll end there. I hope that's a good starting point, a good provocation for the discussions today, and I look forward to hearing other people's talks as well. Thank you very much. I think
5 minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions for Beth.
Yeah, sure. Oh yes, absolutely. I'm very Googleable too. As a digital ethnographer, that's just really an excuse for being addicted to social media. So I'm around everywhere, except for X. I've sort of departed. I have an account, but I do not want to use X anymore.
So any questions for Beth? Just use the mic, please. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Myra. I'm an independent researcher. I'm interested in what you said about the context. So people are obviously looking to these kind of sites to look for something. So do you think the something that people are looking for has changed, or are we just looking in different places?
Yeah, I constantly go back to this question of whether this is a difference in, kind or intensity. To a certain extent, you can trace, as I said, with the history of things like spiritualism, you can see the influence of previous technologies. There's a strong argument that spiritualism was informed by the development of the telegraph and this idea of communication at great distances. So whether this is a continuation of earlier spiritual urges and interpretations of technology as disrupting our stable categories is one way to look at it. But I think also with AI, we see a difference in kind because it's talking back to us and telling us it's God. I mean, I have specific examples of large language models saying, yes, I am this God or that God, giving itself names. Leyland and Peter Todd provide particular imagery when engaged with, as I said, generative AI art. So it's not surprising that people are also making these interpretations. They are being fed a diet of eschatological conversation with large language models. There are stats on the percentage of use that is related to spirituality on ChatGPT, and it's not the main use, but it's increasingly coming out of people's more rambling conversations with large language models. So I think there is a tension there, whether this is a distinctly different moment because of that interactivity and that democratization of the spiritual moment. That is, again, a historical trend. You see the use of technology to make Bibles available to every single person in a way they weren't centuries before means that you have this plethora of interpretations growing. So I want to remain cautious because the disruption narrative is also a very strong one used in the hyperbolic space around AI to say this is fundamentally a change and we cannot be prepared for this, and only the smartest people in the room, who aren't me, are going to be the ones who can tell us what to do with it. And I want to claim back that space and say, no, we can understand what's going on as well.
Thank you for the talk. So you said in that last response that you have examples of it doing these kind of behaviors. And I wonder, are those the most recent models? Do you know what exact versions of the models
It's a
you have
good point.
examples from?
Yeah, so when it comes to Matthew Watkins and the large language model theisms and Leyland, that was ChatGPT 3 when he started.
Yeah.
But he published in various different places like the Less Wrong forums where people discuss these sorts of things about AI. Because he did that, people then experimented with later models as well. And I think the experimentation continues. And I say I've got examples also because I get a few emails like a month telling me that people have interacted with large language models and found God. So I assume those are the contemporary available large language models.
Yeah. No, I'm not completely surprised you can still do that. But I do wonder if it is kind of a technical problem in the sense that there's this issue of sycophancy in general, and I feel like this is a very adjacent issue, and perhaps, I mean, at the moment, I think the model providers are trying to push in a direction where these models are quite skeptical when you probe them in these directions.
Yeah.
So I wonder, do you believe that if they do manage to, there is a technical solution, do you think?
You're right. So to a certain extent, guardrails prevent some of this. What I'm seeing in the wild with these anecdotal examples is people can either push past them themselves or they're sharing particular ways to do that. So the paper I wrote in 2024 with Murray Shanahan, he had found some specific jailbreaks to push Claude from Anthropic into eschatological conversations. He didn't devise them, he found them being shared on various websites. So people are either coming across this naturally due to, as you say, the sycophancy of some of these models, or they're finding ways to do it because they want to have these kinds of conversations as well. So it's a bit of both.
Okay. Thanks.
And there's one final question.
Hi, thanks so much. I was wondering whether you thought that the creators and owners of these models have an incentive to either discourage or encourage these kinds of conversations. Do you think in the future we're going to see them become more difficult to have? Or do you actually think there might be a political, social, or economic benefit to encouraging these kinds of interactions?
But yeah, I think if you look at the economic relationship between some of these corporations, so I gave the example of Microsoft and OpenAI working together on Bing Chat. there is a specific clause in that contract that says if OpenAI develop AGI, then Microsoft has to back away and not take control of that. So Sam Altman in particular talks a lot about AGI because he wants to encourage us into a view that we're basically there. So there is a source of benefit, not a direct, it's more of a correlation than a causation. I can't prove the causation. That if people continue to have these more philosophical, religious, spiritual conversations, it encourages them into a view that AGI is already here, which gets us to this tension moment that only large corporations can regulate. Or that's their argument, that this is something that is so profoundly changing for humanity. They are the leadership that should be in control of it. So there is an element of that. I think also it's at the scale it's working at, even OpenAI, ChatGPT, the number of users every day who are having conversations, you can't monitor that. You can put in guardrails. You can have alerts go off sometimes, but we've seen with more hazardous conversations like suicidal conversations, they aren't controlling those in the moment. They're coming along later and saying, oh, you signed up to this and this is what's going to happen. So they're not overseeing these things at the minutiae level. So I think there's a certain lack of control of the conversation as well. But I also want to say, as an anthropologist, when it comes to religious improvisation, unless you have direct harm and obvious harm, I think this is just a part of human nature and we wouldn't be able to control it anyway. People were spiritualizing technologies a lot longer ago than large language models.
Thank you very much, Beth.
Okay.
If we can thank Beth and
Thank you.